I got my green tea, let's give this a crack. Doom 3 is quite often panned for being deviant from the original ethos of the series, yet I can't help but think otherwise. At its core, the original Doom is simply about killing stuff and finding the exit to the level. It's a purely visceral experience with no pretense in having a narrative or much deviation from its core ideas. Really, it's an engagement of only the player's base senses, sight, sound and reaction. Doom runs on instinct, whereas a game like Half-Life aimed to broaden its scope into creating a cohesive link between its mechanics, story and world. Yet Half-Life's impact on the perception of what games could do was so intrusive that when it came to creating a third Doom sequel post Half-Life, even the granddaddy franchise that wrote the original book on FPS design had to change. Or did it? The benefit of hindsight is that it allows us to perceive and reflect on events with a greater understanding as to why something may have happened the way it did. Also, what comes with it is a certain degree of clarity. Looking back upon video games separated from the immediate ruminations of the time helps us to achieve a more objective view of at least the artistic and cultural context of a given game's development and release. We'll of course never be able to achieve full objective closure upon said events, only our own interpretations and imposed narratives. Playing Doom 3 in 2020, a player doesn't necessarily have the baggage of expectation a player at the time of the game's release would have, so a more rounded and historically informed look at the game is possible. In the simplest of terms, you don't get caught up in the hype. Given that we've seen the cycle with reinvention that Doom 3 represents happen in franchises elsewhere and since, we're in a position now to rationalise Doom 3's apparent shifts in focus. I brought up Half-Life previously, and in the landscape post Black Mesa, the decisions made in developing Doom 3 can be understood with a lot more congruency towards why the game is how it is, rather than just leaving it at the statement that it is just different. The position held by a lot of people is that the game is too deviant from the philosophy and draw of the original games. This time round, Doom has turned to an almost survival horror template, with an emphasis on claustrophobic encounters that string together tension rather than constant action. In Doom you move absurdly fast, in Doom 3 you're much slower with limited sprint. The original was structured in maze-like levels, and hunting for keys while stealing with onslaughts of demons was the definitive mode of play. In Doom 3, you're maybe dealing with a handful of enemies at the most hectic of times. These are just a couple of the changes commonly listed as not only negatives but thoroughly anti-Doom. Even with those who take kindly to the game might even justify their stance by saying it's a good game, it's just not a good Doom game. On the surface that seems apparent. Doom 3 immediately draws comparison with Half-Life because its opening plays out almost identically. You turn up late to work, gear yourself up, do your job, then it all goes to shit. Where Half-Life would see through this pretense it begins with, this is in fact where Doom 3 starts to drop it entirely. Black Mesa is meant to convince you that it's a feasible place by disguising the design of the levels around its function within the narrative. The UAC facility, on the other hand, very quickly establishes itself as being a slave to the gameplay rather than being a convincing space. As soon as the floor falls like an elevator to ambush you with zombies coming out of fake walls, it's like the game is saying, okay, we gave you your context, and now let's get down to the real shit. It's also where the criticisms of the game being less Doom-like begin to falter a bit. Just like the original game's lack of care towards presenting a story, Doom 3 doesn't really care about being anything other than the schlocky B-horror that is deep within its roots. The environments are the first point of testament to that and are rendered through what was a brand new engine at the time. You can spot an id Tech 4 game from a screenshot. I remember thinking Quake 4 looked a hell of a lot like Doom when I first saw images of it. The world looks like it's sculpted from clay and the characters look like plasticine and rubber models. It never looks realistic, instead like an action figure version of reality, and it's the game's distinct texture and adds to the charm. The game definitely looks seated in the era it was made, but in a confident way, future-proofed by its airtight approach to atmospheric lighting that holds the game's visuals together. Contrary to the popular critique, that lighting's not just for show. It's so involved in how you play the game that it might as well be called a mechanic, one that you have direct agency in moulding by the use of the flashlight. And thus is born the key tension of Doom 3. Do you want to see the enemies or shoot them? Because you can't do both at the same time. Then you notice there are tricks for you to learn as to maneuver within this purposeful limitation. The Imp's fireball gives away its position, Soldier's gunfire does the same, with the faint glow of possessed eyes approaching from the shadows as a subtle cue for an ambushing zombie. You begin to realise that Doom 3 is a finely tuned machine, every inch of it planned and pored over to maximise every part of its space. It's a fairground haunted house with the demons of hell jumping out at you instead of theatre school graduates dressed up as your favourite non-copyright versions of horror movie villains. I used to think the ambushes that never made any architectural sense were nonsense, cheap tricks used to shock the player without any real craft behind them. Yet actually they're in keeping with the original game, which would pull the same tricks. Part of realising the UAC facility is just a movie set is also learning to have fun with its artificiality. It's the ace up the game's sleeve that allows it to subvert a traditional comparison to its contemporaries. Half-Life establishes itself as grounded enough for it to be shackled to a more naturalistic design. It takes its setting seriously and thus could never use the monster closet tricks that Doom can. It would crush the entire philosophy of Valve's game. It's funny because I've heard critique of Doom 3 as a game taking itself too seriously, yet it clearly doesn't. Half-Life takes itself seriously, and so it cannot get away with what Doom does. Doom 3 knows it can't match the naturalistic qualities of Half-Life, and so doesn't even try, outside of those opening moments. That's the game's strength. It leans into itself being the B-movie. Half-Life 2 may have been the prestige picture released in the same year, but sometimes it's the 90-minute funhouse ride you find yourself returning to over and over again, in the sense that Doom 3 is less of an investment and more immediately capable of jumping you into carefree action. It never slows you down once you start. All cutscenes are skippable and there aren't really a ton of alterations to the pace or types of set pieces you'll fight through. And that's fine because sometimes you just want to rip and tear rather than invest in an experience. What some might say is the less of Doom 3 is in fact its more. It's a video game-ass video game, and it has fun with being that. I find that infectious when handled the way Doom 3 does. It makes it easy to always come back to it, just like the original game. The levels themselves weave around and follow the classic flow of finding access keycards and PDAs, and throws enemies at you as nasty guidance towards the right direction. If a pinky demon spawns to ambush you, you know you're heading in the right way. Although the game's tactics become predictable, it's the layouts of where the combat encounters take place that drive the dread. You're always up close to the demons, exactly the opposite of where you'd like to be, and it's an inversion of the typical Doom formula. Yet it works because it forces you to think faster, react quicker. It would do you well to prioritise enemies in the original game, but by shoving the demons in your face like Doom 3 does, in usually jarring and disarming ways, it truly lives in an area of twitch reflexes. You're kept on your toes at all times, and it makes for an intensely pressuring experience. This trickery and cheap tactics also goes a long way to sell the great impression of evil that the forces you're dealing with possess. They hardly play fair, and the echoes of ominous, if cheesy, satanic laughter does make you feel foil to the presence that has invaded the base. Hell's toying with you, and that really sells its maleficence.
Offline. Please follow safety procedures.
What's not as easy to buy, however, is the few choices Doom 3 does make to try and match its contemporaries. While the game goes out of its way to disregard a sense of naturalism in its world design, audio logs seem to butt heads with the philosophy when they get too deep into the inner workings of the base. A lot of them are, frankly, boring. Too much time is spent letting people monotonously talk and explain stuff that is so uninteresting that when a locker code is typed in an email, it comes as some relief, since you don't have to spend a minute listening to someone talk about nothing for ages before inexplicably spouting off codes to unlock a secret at the end. They seem so fake too, and not in the good ways in which fun can be had with the ridiculousness of the ever-transforming walls that hide enemies. Most audio logs only function as devices to hide keypad codes and some oddball explanation as to why a plasma gun is in the office cupboard. And that pattern becomes really apparent to the point of amusement, so all the recordings end up sounding something like this. Hi, this is the audio log of Johnny Marsman, electrician for the Delta Labs. So blah blah blah, fuse box, blah blah blah, I had to replace the wires with cheese string, blah blah, power outage, blah, hearing creepy voices, blah blah blah. Oh yeah, by the way, there's a rocket launcher in the locker 123, the code is 789, end of vlog, see ya. The best entries in the PDA are the ones that have fun with the knowledge of the game's inherent ridiculousness, like the guy complaining that there was a mistake made in ordering an excessive amount of chainsaws to the base by accident. What are we gonna do with all these chainsaws, he types, and you can totally imagine the guy's bewilderment. What I can't imagine is why the PDA and the large amount of data you find happens to not consistently share the playfulness the combat design does. Perhaps id felt some obligation to try and explain the world they created, but then again the story is literally about the opening of a teleporter to the shores of hell itself, with a villain so knowingly camping his transparent intentions that it's strange the final strand of the narrative content be as confused as it is. This is what the 2016 reboot really took into consideration, not really caring to explain itself too much. The growing pains of having the confidence to do so is definitely felt in Doom 3, but luckily they're not hard to ignore. What's not avoidable in Doom 3 is the final couple hours, a place where I think hell overstays its intrusion a little bit too much, and the game starts to drag against the boxes it must check in order to be fully Doom. Going to hell seems like the final slope to slide towards a finale, but it's not, and the game sends you back up to the UAC where the faster, more brutal action pace of the hell levels is usurped by the previous rhythms of claustrophobic close scrapes. The proposed cycle of Doom 3 is that you start out under-equipped, then gain better weapons to deal with the increasing challenge of combat, until you become fully confident in dealing with the threat that you take the fight to them. It's the same as the original game, except in 1993 you would pick up steam until the very final boss. By making such a dramatic shift to the depths of hell at the start of the final fourth of the game, but then reverting back to the setting of the UAC, there's a stagnation in Doom 3's pacing until you finally go back to hell to fight the Cyber Demon. Rip and tear until it is done has become the series' mantra, and arriving in hell feels like that final tear into the heart of evil that's been tormenting you throughout the game. But the way it's handled truly deflates the final hours, as it's back to grey corridors and calling for elevators not shortly after. I found myself rushing through the final 90 minutes just to get it over with rather than finding catharsis in a final destructive battle and triumph. While it's not entirely flawless in its execution, it's the recontextualization of the Doom formula into a new space that makes Doom 3 quite a unique and interesting game, especially for its time. There are trivial differences that some will point to as critique, such as having to reload your weapon or reducing the movement speed, but these are the concessions used to help Doom 3 sneak itself into the midst of a fundamentally shifting attitude towards the shooter in the mid-2000s. I fully suspect that if Doom 3 had come out in 2004, playing exactly like its previous iterations, it would have been panned as yet another Doom game. Just look at how the fundamentals of a game like Call of Duty get ravaged by people claiming it doesn't change, despite being a very specific type of game. Yet even with this pressure, Doom 3 manages to still inherently riff off the core tenets of the series, while giving it something atmospherically unique. What you do in the game is wholly pure and coherent with the franchise history. It's just a shame that the game's been mired by its strong aesthetic changes into the more overt genre of horror. Fun is had with it though, and I think that's a tip towards the game knowing it can't take itself too seriously in order to be a Doom game. All in all, it's ironic how this game's differences is what makes it a notable entry into the series, and more than likely a point to pivot from in regards to following it up with the 2016 reboot. Yeah, it's always been here, with no intentions other than ripping and tearing just like the old games used to.
Marines en route. Fresh faces will help. Sergeant Tyson, out.
Perhaps I'd felt some obligation to try and explain the world they could. Fuck's sake, id. Perhaps Id felt some obligation to try and explain the words. Perhaps Id felt some obligation to try and explain the world they created.